We found a pair of glasses. That's not going to work. I don't think there's any batteries to it. Yeah. We found a pair of glasses in the youth room, so if anyone is missing a pair of specs, you can like go me, or afterwards come get them more discreetly if that's what you're. It's a good day to be in the house of the Lord. So we spent the last month in the book of Ruth, and we get to the stunning conclusion of the end of the book this week. I don't know about you, but I always find something very satisfying about being at the end of something and getting to the ending. And really what we're going to see in chapter 4 of Ruth is a resolution of the pain that we encountered in chapter 1. Naomi's emptiness, her bitterness. Just the sheer struggle of everything that she had been walking and going through. We finally actually get to see God stepping in to that space. So far, the theme that we've been following has been this notion of hesed, or this sort of faithful covenant kindness that we have, that we should be sharing with each other and that God shares with us. We've been looking so far at how it's been shared between Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Boaz showing much more kindness and faithfulness than what he's needed to. Ruth being far kinder to Naomi than what she's needed to. And then even in chapter 3, Naomi taking that next step out and being kinder to Ruth in a way that she probably doesn't need to. And today what we're going to really see is God's hesed, Yahweh's faithfulness, and his covenant blessing that he shares, and his kindness, which God is kinder to us than perhaps what he needs to be. We're going to start chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." So the last chapter ends with this cliffhanger question of, will Boaz be able to redeem Ruth? Or will the person who is nearer redeem her? And if we're following the fine print of that situation, we understand that regardless of the outcome, Ruth and Naomi are getting redeemed. It's not a question of are you being redeemed, but a question of who is going to do it. Will Boaz do it, or will this other gentleman, the man who is nearer, do it? And the reason I think why the question still carries this dramatic pull is, again, we've seen the integrity and the goodness of Boaz. And we don't know about the integrity and the goodness of this other individual. And the women are vulnerable. Ruth and Naomi are vulnerable, and even in this sort of situation, if they are redeemed by a person that does not have integrity, the fact that they're vulnerable means that still great harm can come to them. Again, we see this happen in Genesis chapter 38 with the story of Judah and Tamar. We see Tamar die with, or have her husband die without an heir. And we see that no one in the family is willing to take care of her, and Tamar winds up destitute as a result. And she winds up having to come up with a plan to take matters into her own hands in order to fix the situation. So this situation could very easily go south. Just simply being redeemed. If she were to be redeemed with a man without integrity, there could be a lot of trouble that could come as a result of that. And perhaps our first clue, maybe just maybe, that this guy doesn't have a ton of integrity is the fact that he hasn't been introduced into the story up until this point. Naomi's return to the city was something that people noticed. It's not like she snuck back and she's down at the market buying something. It's like, oh look, it's Naomi. I didn't know that you were back. She came back and people recognized the fact that she came back. They noticed. People knew that she had come back. This is a small enough community setting where her arrival doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. So for this other gentleman, the person put in the position of being a redeemer, he knows that Naomi has returned. And he probably knows that she's returned with Ruth in hand. And yet, he has made no forward steps to addressing any of the issues that these women might have had. He is not being proactive in his responsibilities as a redeemer. That in itself shows us this, maybe he's certainly not the same sort of man that Boaz is. Boaz goes to the city gates to wait for this gentleman to come to him. City gates are often a place in which you would conduct business. So that makes sense. He comes, he sits down, and he waits for the guy to pass in, which odds are the guy's going to be passing the gates at some point in time, coming into the town to do something, or it's not, the fact that he would be sitting there waiting isn't something that would be completely unexpected, and it's not the sort of thing that he might sit there and wait for days waiting for this guy to come in. The guy's going to show up sooner or later. Have you noticed that the guy doesn't have a name? Makes talking and telling the story a little bit more difficult. This is actually a fact that the King James translation highlights a little bit more clearly, and if we were reading it in Hebrew, would be even more clearly yet. So verse 1 in the King James reads, Then Boaz went up to the gate and sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by. And unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. It's an awkward Hebrew word that's being used here, and it's a Hebrew word that is accentuating the fact that we are not being given a name. It would be like, Joe Schmo, come sit down here, or John Doe, or... So the such a one translation feels a little bit awkward, but it's getting at the fact that the guy's name is being withheld. Now, I seriously doubt that Boaz in his conversation would have said to him, Joe Schmo, come sit down here. Because that would be rude, right? And that's probably not the way that you would want to start this sort of exchange off. And I'm pretty sure that Boaz knows the guy's name. Again, this is a small community. This is the narrator taking a step back and telling us, I'm not telling you this guy's name. I'm not giving this gentleman the dignity of being named. So there we are, strike two on this, on our perception of this gentleman. The narrator is going out of his way to making sure that he doesn't give him a name for us to be able to identify him by. But Boaz does more than meet with Mr. So-and-so here. He goes and he finds 10 elders and gathers them to give witness to the proceedings. And as we're going to find, this is a relatively important thing that I think he has done here, because these witnesses serve to protect his integrity and the integrity of the proceedings that are coming. Boaz presents the situation to Mr. So-and-so in two movements here. In the movement one, he talks about Naomi's need. Naomi is selling this tract of land. Now, the word sell is perhaps somewhat awkward to describe what's going on here, because land cannot be sold in Hebrew culture. Your family is given this tract of land as your inheritance, and you are not able to permanently sell it. What you are able to do is you are able to sell the land's usage to someone else. And you would do that in hard times. And every 49 years, the year of Jubilee would happen, in which the usage of all land reverts back to the individual who physically owns it. Old Testament law is very careful in Hebrew culture about making sure that each family retains their own property. And that property cannot be amassed by rich individuals taking advantage of good and bad times of other people. Hebrew law is very careful to make sure that that can't happen. So in the sense of which Naomi is selling the land, what we're referring to is land rights. Because again, the physical property can't be sold. But does that strike anyone here as being somewhat problematic based off of everything that we've gone through in the book of Ruth up until this point? If Naomi has land rights, how could the women have been financially destitute? Why has Ruth been gleaning if Naomi has these land rights? It would be extremely unlikely when Naomi's husband Elimelech left the land that he wouldn't have addressed his land when he did it, when they went to Moab, leaving the famine, Amalek, more likely than not, would have sold his land rights, because he's not going to be here using the land. That would be a complete wasted asset for him to disappear for 20 years and own this tract of land that he isn't getting anything out of. It makes far more sense that Naomi doesn't actually have these land rights herself. They have probably been sold to a third party somewhere along the road. Which means that there's a hidden step being presented here by Boaz. For Naomi to sell these land rights, you have to redeem them for her first. You have to go to the third party to acquire the land rights for Naomi, so that Naomi might then be able to sell them to you for you to be able to redeem. That's kind of what the process of being a kinsman redeemer is actually about. It's about going to that third party who has the land rights, who has possession of the land, and buying it back and returning it to the person that it belongs to. And the man that he's talking to, he seems to fully grasp the whole picture of this. This idea that he actually is going to be going and getting the land from somebody else. That he's being asked to redeem the land, and that the land isn't actually in Naomi's hands right now. But the land belongs to someone else. And he's like, sure, I can go and redeem her land and put her land back into her family's name, and then buy her land rights. Because Naomi doesn't have an heir. This is one of the very few ways that you actually could permanently acquire property, is for a family to die out. And we see Mr. So-and-so jump on the opportunity here. He's jumping on the opportunity to be able to actually acquire this land permanently. Sure, I can take Naomi's land rights. I can redeem them back into her family, and then when Naomi will never have an heir that will have to perpetuate this, and it will just stay in my estate. But then Boaz adds, well, sure, good, you've redeemed the land. You get Ruth with it. And with Ruth, you can provide that heir. So that way the land will stay in Naomi's family through Ruth's line. For us, it takes a little bit of work to sort through the legalistic nature of what's going on here. But if we were native Hebrews, we would probably grasp this a little bit more firmly. I don't think the idea for Mr. So-and-so that he would have to provide a child through Ruth is probably not a surprise. But I think he would have figured, well, Ruth is a Moabite, a foreigner. I can probably find a way to make this work out to my advantage. I can probably make it so there never is an heir that's provided here. And Boaz is stepping back and saying, when you buy that land, this is the expectation that I and all of these witnesses that I have gathered have. There will be people that will be watching you and looking at you, making sure that you're treating Ruth well, and that you're working towards actually redeeming the land and providing an heir for her family. And that's when the man steps back and says, no, I can't do that. I can't spend my own money out for land that I'm not going to actually be able to keep, to redeem this back in. And maybe we can sympathize with them. I mean, this is in a post-famine economy. You know, the famine has just ended. You know, maybe he does have to look after his own, but maybe we can sympathize with that point, but I don't think we're supposed to be sympathizing with him, because he's leaving the women and has left the women destitute and on their own. But this is where we see again Boaz's integrity and Boaz's wisdom in gathering together witnesses. Gathering together a group of people who will step back and give accountability and legitimacy to the situation at hand. Because in doing so, he protects not only himself and Mr. So-and-so, but he's also protecting the women. And I imagine for Boaz to have went out and gathered these 10 individuals for this probably took a little bit of work. Now, it's not like he's popping out a cell phone and calling people and saying, oh, I need you here today. He's having to go to their house and convince them that they need to come and gather all these people. That would have taken time and energy and effort. Is it sometimes a pain providing accountability for ourselves? It can take a lot of extra work, it seems like. I could just go and do this and it would be so much simpler if I could just go and do, but rather I take the next steps behind in order to keep myself accountable, and it makes the task that much more burdensome. But there's a benefit to having accountability. And that's that our integrity gets protected. And the integrity of the situation gets protected. And the integrity of other people get protected. When we take that next step of gathering together those people that we know will keep us making good, strong decisions. Now, this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal, and then Boaz said to the others and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Amalek, and that all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. And also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all of the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephraim and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. The witnesses bless Boaz and Ruth. We've seen what you have done, and it is a good thing. And they offer blessing. They offer, this almost feels like it's almost got like a celebratory quality to it. To where all the elders are like, this is a good thing that has happened. We've spoken of Boaz's integrity, and part of me wonders, well, where did Boaz get that from? How did Boaz wind up being such a man of integrity? Certainly, I think he would get it from being transformed by the law, transformed by Scripture. But we also see here I think he's getting it from the fact that he's surrounding himself with able-bodied people who keep him accountable to doing the right thing. And when we make that decision to include other people into our walk in order to help make sure that we do the right thing, I think it becomes so much easier. It's part of the value of living in community. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Solomon. Solomon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Ruth and Boaz marry, and God gives them a child, and seemingly quickly so. Remember, Ruth had been married for 10 years to Mahlon without a child. Ruth was barren as well. But it's not Ruth's barrenness that the story is still focused on here. It's Naomi's. It's the women going to Naomi and said, "The Lord has given you this. Praise be to God." So interesting from an Old Testament attitude, especially children are a gift from God. And that children are gifts straight from God. And here they are saying, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you barren, who has not left you cut off, who has not left you emptied." The pain and the anguish of chapter 1 has been addressed and dealt with. The emptiness and the barrenness. And it's now filled with joy. It's filled with praise. This is God's covenant faithfulness to us. To fill our emptiness with joy. It doesn't get much better than that, does it? And the thing is, do we believe this? Do we believe that this is the God that we serve? That God is actually faithful this way? Because it's hard when we're back in chapter 1 and we're feeling the emptiness and the pain and we're saying, "Well, God has brought me low to this point." You know, when our theology of suffering isn't very strong and we're having those moments of anger and anguish, we cry out to God and we let God step in to that space to bring us comfort. It's hard in that space, I think, sometimes to trust in God's ability to heal and God's ability to fill. But I think that's what the story of Ruth is all about, is God's faithful to heal and fill, especially when we put ourselves in a position to be blessed. So at the very end, we are given the information that King David eventually comes from this line. And if you've been a student of the Bible for any length of time, King David is a pretty big name that pops up. And God does some pretty interesting things in David's life. I wonder if Naomi would have thought that someday, big picture-wise, she would be a part of something that big that God was doing. She certainly would, it wouldn't be something that she would see come to pass. But this gives us the opportunity to take a look at the story and step back and take a look at the big picture and say, well, God showed his faithfulness to these two women, dramatically changing their lives and their situation. And while God was doing that in that space, he was also preparing other plans that he had later down the line. I'm not going to claim that our lives are as significant as Ruth or Boaz's. But I do wonder what the big picture ramification of some of our lives might be. If we were able to take that step back and telescope and look at where our lives were and what God did in our lives, how that might actually resonate in the bigger picture of things. I think it certainly broadens how we perceive ourselves in God's story. Because God has lots of plans that he's working through all the time. We end with a little bit of genealogy here. And there's something about this story that should seem somewhat off in the list of names that are presented. Because in most situations of a kinsman redeemer, Obed wouldn't be in Boaz's line. Obed would be in Elimelech's line. But that's not what we're given here. We're given a story of a genealogy of David that includes Boaz's name as the kinsman redeemer. And I think that's part of this genealogy, is telling us this story of Boaz brought an integrity to a situation. Boaz brought God's healing and hesed into this situation. And when you read this list of names and you see Boaz, you think about that in that space. And part of who Boaz is reflected in who David becomes. And so when we look at this list of names, we see David as a reflection of Boaz. Maybe that's another thought for the value of integrity for us. When we are known as an individual with integrity, it has a way of passing itself down to future generations. Future generations think back to my old grandma who was always on her knees praying. And those sorts of individuals resonate in their lives. I feel like this is an odd moment for us to sometimes encounter in Scripture when we get an opportunity to see maybe just a little bit of what God's doing outside of ourselves. Yes, we can step in and say, it is a really good thing for us to see God's faithfulness to Naomi and God addressing and filling her barrenness. Blessed be the name of the Lord for doing that. But we also get the added next step of saying, God's probably got something else going on in the big picture as well. The significance in what's going on in our lives, simply beyond ourselves that it's going to impact other Christians and other Christians potentially even in the future. I think this gives us really good encouragement for us to really look at the value of our integrity and how we live. And I think that's really what sits at the heart of the book of Ruth, is the way in which you choose to live ultimately allows God to do a great many good and wonderful things. A couple of takeaways from chapter 4 here. Accountability protects integrity for individuals and events and is often worth the hassle that it takes for us to get it properly set up. God is faithful, has said to his people, God is faithful to fill our emptiness, fill our pain, take care of our ugly and dirty crying tears. Our lives fit into a larger story for God's people. And we may not see all of what that means, but it does show that we have an existence in a place that exists beyond just simply our own lives. I will close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for being a God who fixes our broken hearts, for being a God who addresses our pain, for being a God who meets our needs and in the places that we are in. We want to thank you for your faithfulness and your love. I want to pray that each of us here would see and recognize the value of maintaining our integrity. In a world in which integrity seems to be an ever diminishing quality, I want to pray that you show each of us just what you are able to do with our integrity. I want to pray that you embolden each of us to be proactive in looking at the suffering in the world around us and asking the question, how can I step out and meet it? In your name, amen.